Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to discuss some key aspects of politics, economy, and society of Joseon Korea to help you better understand what happened in the late 19th century Joseon Korea. Joseon was the last dynasty in Korea that lasted for more than 500 years, from 1392 to 1910, when it was formally annexed to the Japanese Empire. The founder of the dynasty was Yi Seung-ge, so sometimes Joseon Korea was called Yi Korea. Anyway, he made his name by winning many battles against the Jurchens, later the Manchus, who were threatening the northern borders of Korea, and the Japanese pirates that marauded the coastal areas. Having accumulated enough military and political power, he forced the last king of Goryeo dynasty to step down in favor of him. And he opened a dynasty named after an ancient Korean kingdom, Joseon, which is often translated as morning come. In this endeavor, he was assisted and guided by some of the Neo-Confucian scholars who were increasing in numbers at the time. The main architect of the Joseon system was a scholar named Jung Do-jeon. He wanted to build an ideal Neo-Confucian state in sharp contrast to the preceding aristocratic Goryeo dynasty. Jung wrote Cause for Running Joseon State, the blueprint of the new government. The cause for running Joseon State was, so to speak, a compendium of modern-day constitution, civil codes, penal codes, tax codes, and commercial codes put together. It was later expanded to the comprehensive cause for running the state, and was the philosophical, constitutional, legal, and practical foundation for the Joseon state. In comparative perspective, the Joseon's government system had many similarities to Ming China, another Confucian state, but thanks to Jung Do-jeon, Joseon was more radical in pursuing Confucian ideals and had some significant differences in terms of its human-centered orientation and constraints placed on the monarchical power, as I will explain later. The land system adopted by Joseon shows how serious Jung Do-jeon was in building a human-centered Confucian state. Jung had Yi Seung-ge implement a sweeping land reform 1 year before he ascended the throne. By that time, he had accumulated so strong political power that virtually no one in the court could challenge him. His political opponents had been killed, exiled, or silenced. Lands were confiscated from the nobles and distributed equally to the tillers, as proposed in Mencius, one of the main Confucian classics. In accordance with the Confucian adage, all under heaven is the king's land, and all within the four seas are king's subjects. The king formerly held the title, but the tillers had the usual rights, usufruct. The tillers were to pay 10% of the harvest as a land tax, which was cut in half or less in later reforms. Government officials were given service lands to collect rents from, in addition to their small yearly salary in kind. Even after their services were over, they were allowed to keep the lands for life in the early years of Joseon dynasty. With the government lands rapidly decreasing, King Sejo, the seventh king of Joseon, had the law revised so that the lands were to be returned to the state at the end of their tenure. However, the unmarried widows and the orphaned children of officials could keep the land. The Joseon state clearly had vestiges of a patrimonial state. Patrimonial state is a term used by Max Weber to characterize a form of pre-modern rule in Western Europe. It is an extended version of household rule and rules the country as if it were a patrimony or household inheritance of the ruling house. The passage I quoted above from the book of the Oath, quote, all under heaven is the king's land, and all within the four seas are king's subjects, unquote, reflects the patrimonialistic thinking. But by all accounts, the Joseon state was one of the most bureaucratic, centralized states of the time. First, officials were recruited on the meritocratic basis, mainly through the statewide civil and military service examinations. They were promoted and job assigned in relative accordance with the codified rules and regulations of the comprehensive codes for running the state. Second, government organizations were functionally differentiated. There were six ministries: personnel, revenue, rights and foreign affairs, justice, construction, military and defense. In addition, there were specialized government agencies. Not only the provincial government, but even the lowest level of local administration was headed by an official dispatched from the center. The provincial governor's tenure was limited to 360 days, and the tenure of local government heads was limited to the maximum of 5 years. And an official was never sent to his native place, so that neither collusion nor a subversive alliance was made between local administrative head and the local elites and population. The provincial and local governments were structured in a similar fashion to the central government. It was divided into 6 functionally differentiated departments. The provincial governors often concurrently held the positions of the regional Army or Navy command. There were separate local commands at strategic locations, but these commands often had to rely on the local governments for their expenses. So a civilian superiority or civilian control of the military was near complete. Provincial and local government heads were assisted by unsalaried office runners who were Jungmin or middle class people, which I'm going to explain, and the job was passed from father to son. In Joseon Korea, this was virtually the only prebend. Prebend is another term of Max Weber's, meaning a job that was hereditarily passed from one generation to the next. This also struck a contrast to Ming China. In Ming China, it was more often than not that a regional command was passed from father to son, even when the father had to leave the service in dishonor. By the way, can you guess how many officials were there in Joseon Korea? The comprehensive codes for running the state listed about 8,000 posts, but the actual number of officials was much smaller than this. Many posts were concurrently held. So the actual number was around 6,000. So local governments could not be effectively administered by the officials dispatched from the center and officer runners alone. Local resident Yangban, who were clan leaders or community leaders, were to assist the administration. At the same time, the local government heads were tasked to make sure that the good behavior of the local Yangban. So the government played the officials against the local Yangban to make sure peace and order in the local area. But the main difference of Joseon Korea from Ming China and in a sense a unique feature of Joseon governance was that there were institutionalized restraints on royal power. Jung Do-jeon, the architect of the Joseon state, believed that the king should be enlightened, guided, and restrained by the wisdom of scholar officials. He wrote in his statutes for Joseon governance that, quote, king's role is to select state councillors, which mean three prime ministers, and discuss policies with them, unquote. Take a look at the diagram on the right side. On the left hand are the Royal Secretariat, Prosecutor General, and the Special Prosecutor. These offices were the extensions of the royal power. But on the right, Censor General, Inspector General, literature propagation, history officials were there basically to restrain the excesses of the royal power. The king was assisted by the state council made of three prime ministers, but at the same time, the state council, as the supreme representative of literary officials played a strong restraining power over the king. In sharp contrast to China, monarchical power of Joseon kings were not as supreme or absolute. The king's attempts to tip the balance of power between the king and Yangban largely shaped the Joseon court politics. Some kings tried to bring in scholars residing in localities to restrain the old entitled scholar officials. When Joseon Dynasty was first opened, a large number of Neo-Confucian scholars returned to their native places, claiming loyal subjects by Confucian principle could not serve two kings. They concentrated on research, self-cultivation, and teaching the next generation of scholars. When the king brought in these locally resident scholars, the old guards resisted, and which resulted in 4 major purges of scholars. But despite these purges, by 16th century, these formerly estranged scholars came to dominate Korean court politics. By late 16th century, the new scholars began to form factions because of the limited offices and resources relative to the increasing number of passers of state service examination. In appearance, they fought over interpretation of rituals stipulated in Jushi's family rituals. But in fact, these ideological, philosophical struggles entailed power struggles. Initial two factions were later bifurcated into 4 factions. By putting one faction against another and sometimes switching sides, some kings could increase monarchical power against the Yangban power. 2 18th century kings, Yeongjo and Jeongjo, tried a policy of not favoring one faction over the others. By keeping the balance of power among 4 factions, the 2 kings succeeded in strengthening royal power to some extent and implementing some badly needed reforms in tax system. But their success was very limited, we have to admit. King Yeongjo was pressured by a faction in the court, and he had to kill his own crown prince. Then the throne was passed to his grandson Jeongjo, but he also faced several attempts on his life during his reign. King Jeongjo was succeeded by his son Sunjo. From his reign, the royal in-laws became powerful in the court at the expense of the kings. These royal in-laws abused their power and ran the state affairs to their liking, including arbitrary appointment and promotion of government officials. Lord Acton once mentioned, quote, power corrupts, absolute power absolutely corrupts. That was exactly what happened in the 19th century Joseon. Andong Kim clan and the Pungyangjo clan took turns abusing political power. Offices were sold and bought. As we shall see next time, the rule by royal in-laws appeared to have ended when the regent Daewon-gun, King Gojong's father, expelled them from the court. But it revived when Gojong began to rule in person. Gojong's consort, Queen Min's Yeongmin clan, came to control the court. Corruption of the court simply accelerated Joseon Korea's demise. Well, this diagram is more or less a realistic representation of the social status system in Joseon Korea. Theoretically, there were only four social statuses. Yangban literati, or learned man at the top. Then came the peasants. Then artisans or craftsmen. Then merchants. They were respected and socially valued in that order. In addition to these, there were a large number of social outcasts called Cheonmin, literally meaning despicable people. As you can see, they performed socially indispensable roles, but were stuck at the bottom of social pyramid. The dividing line between the despicable people and the rest of the society was extremely rigid and almost insurmountable, as indicated by a thick line in the diagram. Since the social status was determined by the mother's status, if one was born of a Yangban father and a slave mother, he or she became a slave. Strictly legally speaking, the door to the Yangban status was open to all commoners as long as they passed the civil and military service examinations. Those who were born in the wedlock could become a Yangban. In practice, however, it was almost impossible to scale up the social ladder and to become a Yangban because preparation for the service examinations took 20 to 30 years of hard study, which was virtually beyond the means of most of the common people. Between the commoners and Yangban were Jungin, or middle people, who in modern parlance can be called technocrats. They were interpreters, medical doctors, astronomers who passed the miscellaneous service examinations. Those who were born of a Yangban father and a concubine were not allowed to take the civil and military service examinations, but allowed to take a miscellaneous service examination and become a Jungin. And the office runners of the local administrative offices were also Jungin. Since Yangban was a social category, which was very important in understanding the state-society relations, I'm discussing it separately. Originally, Yangban meant two columns of government officials who lined up in the presence of the king. I do not know how many of you have had a chance to visit the old palaces in Seoul, but if you go to the Royal Office building, you can see the stone rank markers as shown in the photo in the upper right corner of this slide. Using the rank markers, the officials lined up in two columns. The eastern column was civilian officials, while the western column was military officials. So initially, Yangban was a different form of expression used for office holders. But in later periods, its concept was diluted to refer to a privileged status group. It included, but was not limited to, office holders alone. According to Miyajima Hiroshi, a Japanese scholar who studied the social category of Yangban, as it was actually practiced in Joseon dynasty, Yangban in later Joseon uses met four conditions. First, he had to have undisputable pedigree or genealogy that included several passes of state examination or renowned scholars. Second, he had to live in a clan village for generations. Thirdly, he had to maintain a gentlemanly lifestyle, especially meticulous ancestor worship and hospitality to guests. Fourth, he had to choose spouses from a group that met the above three conditions. In Joseon period, no effort was spared to keep the number of Yangban small. For example, unlike China, sons born of a concubine were not given the Yangban status. They were not allowed to take civil and military service examinations. Children born of Yangban father and slave mother became slaves, as I explained before. But several factors contributed to the increase of Yangban. First, there was the natural increase of state exam passers over time. There were two kinds of the most prestigious civil service examination. The regular one was given every 3 years, but on occasions, special examinations were given, and the frequency of the latter type increased over the years. Besides, in times where the passers of the military service examinations were increased dramatically. For example, during the Imjin War with Japan in the last years of the 16th century, the government passed more than 10,000 in a single year. Second, once a family attained the Yangban status, it rarely lost it unless family fortunes nosedived. So there had been cumulative increase. Even if there had not been the natural increase of service exam passers, the number of Yangban families would have increased. Last but not least, increase of Yangban had much to do with the evasive tactics adopted by the common people. Before I explain further, let's take a look at the table, which shows the changing social status composition of the residents of Daegu-bu, the capital of Gyeongsang Province, based on family registers. Since the 1930s, when a Japanese scholar named Shikata Hiroshi first released his researches on the record, this data had long been interpreted as evidence of the collapse of the social status system in late Joseon. But I'm looking the data from a different perspective. This data clearly has another aspect. Anyway, both Yangban and social outcasts were exempt from taxation, which I will explain shortly. Keep that in mind. It is important to understand what I'm about to say. Please look at the table again. Even as late as 1690, Yangban population remained relatively small, even though there had been nearly 3 centuries of service examinations and wars fought with Japanese and Manchus. In 1732 and 1739, there was indeed a rapid increase in Yangban population, but there was a comparable decrease in slave population. This indicates that while many commoners bought their way to attain the Yangban status only in records, why? The answer seems simple: to avoid taxes. And there was a comparable number of slaves buying their manumission. In 1858, however, while Yangban population increased, slave population also increased by a comparable number. What does this mean? Many commoners entered into voluntary servitude. This does not mean they were real slaves. Oftentimes, they paid money to Yangban to be registered on their slave list to avoid taxation. Sometimes they made contracts to be listed as a slave in return for certain portion of their harvest. At any rate, increase of both Yangban and slave population drastically reduced the tax base of the Joseon state. In fact, in the 19th century, the Joseon state faced the fiscal crisis. And even though some argue that the social status system was collapsing, I would say it was disturbed, but did not collapse in its entirety. This genre painting from the early 19th century depicts an encounter between a Yangban and a couple of common people, shows that the social distinction was still very rigid. Look how deeply the man bows to the Yangban. As for tax system, basically there were three kinds of taxes in Joseon Korea. The first was the land tax. In laws, at least, it was not heavy, especially after land tax reforms. The second type of tax was the tribute, or tax paid in special local products. This collective tax imposed on each administrative unit was at first paid in kind. Due to many problems for both the taxpayers and the government, it was collected in fixed amount of rice. In the 17th century, it was finally set at 12 due per each hectare of the land. So it was three times heavier than the land tax. Because it was land-based, it became a virtual land tax. In later Joseon, tax farmers, often in collusion with government officials, collected much more than stipulated by law, causing resentment of the commoners. The third type was the corvette tax. The commoners had to provide corvette labor for government construction projects. The most important of all was the unpaid military services required of all male commoners in the age of 16 to 60. From the 16th century, one could get excused from this compulsory military service by paying 2 bolts or pill of cotton cloth a year. One pill or one bolt was 37.4 centimeter wide and 14 meter and 96 centimeters long. Later, the amount was reduced to one pill a year. American sociologist Charles Tilly once called the 19th century in Europe a century of rebellion. Similarly, in Joseon Korea too, the 19th century proved to be a century of rebellion. As shown in the graph, the frequency and size of the rebellion increased as the years were on. Why was the 19th century became a century of rebellion in Joseon Korea? One of the reasons was the population pressure in a stagnating economy. Imjin War or Hideyoshi invasion of Japan of 1592 to 1598 laid waste a large part of farmland. Hundreds of thousands died. And by all accounts, arable lands and taxable land diminished in size precipitously. On top of that, the rising Manchus invaded Joseon Korea twice, in 1627 and 1636, before their war of conquest against Ming China. The Manchus wanted to remove the possible threat from behind. After the 1636 invasion, around 200,000 Koreans were taken to Manchuria, and only a small portion of them were released for ransom. the country was again devastated. Joseon Korea never fully recovered from these wars. Take a look at the table. While the registered lands remained largely unchanged in the 18th century, there was a noticeable population growth, indicating the increasing hardship of the working population. But the real cause of the rebellions was the widespread corruption, especially the corruption of what Korean historians call three administrations: land-based taxes, military close tax, and state relief loans. As I briefly mentioned, the tax farmers, often in collusion with the corrupt officials, collected much more than stipulated in the law. To scheme, the commoners, the underage, even babies were put on the military service registers. The overaged and even the dead were retained in the register. When they loaned out the relief grains, the corrupt officials distributed low-quality grains undulated with the sands using the undersized measuring vessel. When they took in repayment, they used the oversized vessels to rip the peasants off. So these corruptions were major sources of popular grievances against the government and government officials. While the dynasty was decaying internally, the foreigners were lurching in the Korean waters and started knocking the closed gates of the country. And this will be the topic of my next lecture.